The river was rising fast, and Emma Rourke was standing at its edge deciding whether dying was better than turning back. It was the spring of 1873, and the Montana Territory had not seen rain like this in 20 years. The old-timers in the settlement of Callaway Creek said so every morning over their coffee, shaking their heads and watching the sky like it owed them an apology. The Yellowstone River's tributaries had swollen into brown, churning monsters, and the smaller crossings that settlers used as a matter of daily life had become treacherous walls of moving water. But Emma Rourke had a wagon full of supplies, a mule named Clarence who was already nervous, and a decision to make about whether she was going to let a flooded river stop her from getting home. Home was a generous word for what she had. It was a cabin 3 miles east of Callaway Creek, sitting on 40 acres her father had broken his back to claim before a fever took him in the winter of 1871. Her mother had followed him 6 months later, leaving Emma with the land, the debt on the land, and a younger brother named Thomas who was 17 and studying to be a school teacher, because Emma had insisted he do something with his mind. Thomas was in Callaway Creek right now, boarding with the Hendersons while he studied with the circuit teacher who came through twice a month. Emma had ridden into town that morning to bring him supplies and to collect a package of seeds she had ordered from a merchant in Helena. She had stayed too long. The morning had been clear, and she had let herself eat lunch at the hotel restaurant, which she almost never did, and she had lingered over a piece of apple pie because the cook made it with cinnamon and brown sugar in a way that reminded her of her mother. By the time she had loaded Clarence and started east, the sky had turned the color of old iron, and by the time she reached the crossing at Bitter Creek, the water was up to the wagon axles and climbing. She had pulled Clarence to a stop at the bank, and now she stood at the edge of it, her boots sinking slightly in the mud, looking at the water and making her calculations. The current was fast. The bottom would be slippery. She did not know how deep the middle ran. Clarence was strong, but he was frightened, and a frightened mule could sit down in the middle of a river crossing and refuse to move, and then everything she had on that wagon would be ruined, and she would have wasted a month's careful saving. She was 24 years old, and she had been making difficult decisions alone for 2 years, and she was very tired of it. She did not hear the horse come up behind her. The rain was loud by then, a steady drumming that filled the air and made the cottonwood trees along the bank bow and shiver. She was still staring at the water, her arms crossed over her chest, her jaw set in that particular way she had when she was arguing with herself, when a shadow fell across the bank beside her own. She turned. The man was enormous. That was the first thing she understood about him, not as a judgment but as a simple fact, the way you would note that a mountain was tall or that the sky was wide. He was well over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested he had been built for hauling and carrying and enduring, and he was dressed in the manner of a man who lived far from any town. His coat was heavy canvas, dark with rain. His hat was wide-brimmed and battered. His beard was dark and close-trimmed, and beneath it his jaw was strong, and his eyes, when they looked at her, were the particular gray-green of river water in the shade, and they were calm in a way that Emma found immediately annoying because nothing about this situation was calm. He did not say anything. He looked at the river. He looked at her wagon. He looked at her standing in the mud in her good wool dress and her boots. Then, without a word, without asking permission or offering explanation, he dismounted his horse, which was a large bay gelding that appeared to share its rider's personality of absolute unflappable steadiness, and he tied the horse's reins loosely to the back of the wagon. He came to stand beside Emma and studied the crossing for a long moment. Then he picked her up. He simply bent, put one arm behind her knees and one arm around her back, lifted her as though she weighed approximately the same as a bundle of kindling, and walked into the river. Emma was so startled that she did not speak for a full 5 seconds, which was unprecedented in her experience of herself. She grabbed the front of his coat automatically, her fingers finding the lapels and closing on them, because whatever she thought about being picked up without warning, she did not want to fall into the Bitter Creek flood surge. "Put me down," she said once she had found her voice. He kept walking. The water came up to his knees, then his thighs. The current pushed at him and he leaned into it, adjusting his weight with the ease of long practice, and his footing did not waver. "I am speaking to you," Emma said. He looked down at her then. His expression was not unkind. It was simply occupied, the way a man looks when he is concentrating on a task that requires his full attention. The water reached his waist. Emma, held above it, felt the spray of it cold against her feet and legs. "This is not appropriate," she told him. He reached the far bank in 11 more steps. She counted them, because counting gave her something to do with her indignation. He climbed the bank with her still in his arms, set her down gently on solid ground, and then turned and walked back into the river without having spoken a single word. Emma stood on the east bank of Bitter Creek, her mouth open, watching him go back for her wagon. He crossed again with Clarence's lead rope in his hand, talking low to the mule in a voice she could not hear over the water. Clarence, who had refused to take a single step toward the water when Emma had tried, walked into the river beside this stranger without complaint. The man brought the wagon across in one steady pull, the wheels grinding and bumping over the submerged rocks, the water sheeting off the canvas covering her seed packets and her brother's books and her 20 pounds of flour. He brought them all to the east bank, handed Emma the reins to Clarence, untied his own horse, swung up into the saddle and began to ride east along the bank. Emma stared after him. "Wait," she said. He stopped. She walked to the side of his horse, looking up at him, her wet skirts dragging in the mud and her hair coming loose from its pins in the rain, and she looked him square in the face and said, "Why did you do that?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said in a voice that was low and deliberate, shaped by years of speaking very little, "You were standing there deciding." He said it simply, not as an accusation, not as a compliment, just as a statement of fact. "You were standing there deciding, and I made the decision so we could both move on." Emma Rourke stood in the mud with rain running down the back of her neck and felt something shift in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. "I was going to cross," she said. "Maybe," he said. "I was." "All right," he said, and there was the faintest suggestion of something at the corner of his mouth that might in different light have been the beginning of a smile. "My name is Emma Rourke," she said, because she was not raised to be rude. "I have 40 acres east of here. My father homesteaded it." "I know the place," he said, "Caleb Rourke's land. You knew my father, bought furs from him twice. He was a fair man." Something passed over his face, respectful and brief. "Sorry for your loss. How did you know he passed?" "Word travels in a territory this thin," he said. "Not many people, news moves between them." "And who are you?" she asked. "Gilbert Blackwell," he said. "I trap, I winter in the Upsarokas, I come down to Callaway Creek in spring and fall." "Gilbert Blackwell," she repeated as though she were filing it somewhere safe. "You could have asked before you picked me up." The almost smile appeared again. "You were deciding," he said. "Didn't seem like you needed another opinion." And then he clicked his horse forward and rode east at an easy pace, and Emma stood watching him go with her hands on her hips and her heart doing something entirely uncharacteristic in her chest. She followed because they were both going east, and because her road lay the same direction as his for the next 3 miles. She stayed behind him, watching the easy way he rode, the economy of motion, the way he sat in the saddle as though he had been born there. He did not look back at her, but once, when the road bent around a stand of pine and the footing became treacherous with mud, he slowed enough that her wagon came alongside him, and he picked a different line through the mud with his horse so that her wagon wheels had a track to follow. He did not say he was doing it. He just did it. When they reached the turnoff for her property, a weathered post with a strip of faded red cloth that her father had tied there and she had replaced twice, she pulled Clarence to a stop. "This is my land," she said. He stopped his horse beside her. "My cabin is a 1/4 mile in," she said. "There is a barn." He looked at the sky. The rain was easing slightly, but the light was going. Late April brought early darkness in the Montana Territory, and the clouds were eating the last of the sun. "You will ride on?" she asked. "Still 2 hours to my camp," he said. "I'll manage." Emma Rourke was not a woman who made impulsive decisions. She was careful, methodical, practical to the point where Thomas sometimes accused her of not having any fun at all. She thought before she spoke, and she measured generosity against necessity, and she kept careful accounts of what she gave and what she received. She said, "There is a dry stall for your horse and a hot supper if you want it." He looked at her. She met his eyes steadily because she was not offering anything except what she had stated, and she knew it, and she trusted that he knew it too. "All right," he said. They rode to the cabin together in the rain. It was a small, sturdy place, notched logs chinked with moss and clay, a stone chimney, a porch that her father had built wide enough to sit on in the evenings. Inside it was plain and clean. Emma kept it rigorously clean because order was one of the things she controlled. There was a table, 2 chairs, a wood stove, a narrow bed behind a curtain, shelves of preserved food, and a stack of books that she read by lamplight every night because silence had to be filled with something. She showed Gilbert to the barn, which held Clarence's stall and an empty one beside it. He unsaddled his horse, an exercise that took him perhaps 3 minutes and resulted in the horse being perfectly cared for, and then he carried his saddle to the porch rail because he seemed to know instinctively not to bring the full weight of himself into her space without being asked. She made supper. There was salt pork and dried beans that had been soaking since morning, and she had cornbread batter mixed before she left, so she got the stove going hot and started the cornbread in the pan. She was aware of him on the porch, the occasional sound of him moving, and it was odd having another presence so close. She had been alone in this cabin for 2 years, and before that her parents had been here, and before that it had been the 4 of them, her parents and Thomas and herself, crowded and warm and loud in ways she had not appreciated until it was gone. She called him in when the food was ready. He came through the door and took off his hat, and the lamplight caught the lines of his face. He was older than her. She could see that now in the way she could not quite judge in the rain. She thought perhaps 30, perhaps a few years more. The life he lived put weather in a man's face, and she could see that too, the crinkle at the corners of his eyes, the way he held himself, the sureness of his movements. He had a quiet kind of authority, not demanding, not aggressive, just present. He was a man who had been in many places where there was no one to rely on but himself, and it showed. He ate the way he did everything else, with a kind of steady, appreciative efficiency that involved very little waste and very little comment. But then he said, "Good beans," and it sounded in his voice like more than it was. "My mother's recipe," Emma said. He nodded. "Your father said she was a fine cook. You spoke about her with him." "Not at length. He mentioned it the way men mention things they love, in passing, as if the whole world knows." Emma looked at her bowl. She felt the warmth of that image settle around her like a blanket. "He was like that," she said. "He could not boast. He could only wonder at things, at her mostly." "That is a good kind of man," Gilbert said. "The best," Emma said, and there was grief in it and pride in equal measure, and she did not try to hide either. They sat in a quiet that was not uncomfortable for a while after the dishes were done. The rain had stopped, and the night was still, and somewhere out in the dark a barred owl was asking its question over and over into the trees. "I should tell you," Emma said, because she was not a woman who left things unaddressed, "that I was going to cross that river." "I believe you," Gilbert said. He was sitting in her father's chair, the one with the carved armrests, and he was drinking the last of his coffee with both hands around the mug. "I want to make sure you understand that I am not someone who waits to be rescued." "I understand that," he said. "Good," she said, "because I would hate for there to be any confusion about who I am." He looked at her then directly, the way he had looked at the river crossing, assessing and steady. "There is no confusion," he said. She did not know exactly what he meant by that, but something in the way he said it made her feel, strangely, entirely known. He slept in the barn because she had not offered and he had not asked, and when she woke in the morning he was already gone. his horse gone from the stall, the blanket he had used folded neatly on the hay. On the porch railing she found a piece of paper, torn from something, with 3 words on it in a careful, deliberate hand. "Thank you kindly." She kept the paper. She did not ask herself why. She simply folded it and put it in the drawer of the small table beside her bed, and she did not think very much about that either. 3 weeks passed. Emma worked the land with the kind of ferocity that she used to keep grief at bay. She plowed the kitchen garden and got her seeds in before the second rain came. She repaired the fence on the north pasture, which had sagged through the winter, driving posts with a maul that left her arms aching in the evenings. She rode to Callaway Creek twice, once to see Thomas and once to sell a load of dried herbs and preserves to the general store, which gave her enough money to pay down a portion of the debt she owed on the land to a man named Harding who held the note. Amos Harding was not a kind creditor. He was a round, prosperous man who owned the largest store in Callaway Creek and 3 other properties besides, and he had been making it clear in the polite, relentless way of men who have the law on their side that he expected the Rourke land debt to be settled in full by the end of summer. He had said as much to Emma the last time she came in to make her payment, leaning across his counter with his thumbs in his vest pockets and his small eyes bright with calculation. "Miss Rourke," he had said, "I want you to understand the position. Your father took a loan of $320 against that property in 1870. With interest and the outstanding balance, you are looking at $215 due by September 1st. I want to be fair with you. I want to give you every opportunity." Emma had thanked him with perfect courtesy and driven home with her teeth clenched so tightly her jaw ached. $215. She had 43 in the strongbox under the floorboard and prospects that were real but slow. The herbs sold. The preserves sold. She had talked to a rancher named Pearson about supplying vegetables from her kitchen garden through the summer. She was doing everything right, and she was still looking at a gap between what she had and what she needed that was the size of a canyon. She was thinking about this on a Tuesday morning in mid-May when she heard a horse in her yard. She came to the door with her hands covered in flour because she was making bread, and she expected to see Thomas, who sometimes rode out on Tuesdays when the circuit teacher was in town. Instead, she saw Gilbert Blackwell dismounting in her yard. He was carrying something over his shoulder, wrapped in burlap, and he had 2 rabbits on a line and a bundle of something she could not identify from the doorway. She stood there in her flour-covered apron and watched him walk toward the house. "I was passing," he said when he reached the porch. "Through my yard," she said. "The road comes close," he said, which was technically true because the road from Callaway Creek bent north of her property before going south again. "What is that?" she asked, nodding at the burlap bundle. He set it down on the porch railing. "Hinge hardware," he said. "Your barn door was binding on the bottom rail, needed a new mounting bracket." Emma stared at him. "You noticed that in an evening of lamplight 3 weeks ago." "I notice things," he said, and there was no boast in it, just statement. She looked at the rabbits. "And those, thought you could use them." "Gilbert Blackwell," she said slowly, "did you ride 2 hours from your camp to bring me barn hardware and 2 rabbits?" He seemed to consider whether he should answer this directly. "The creek trail goes by your property anyway," he said. "No," she said, "it does not. I know every trail in these hills, and the creek trail goes 4 miles north of my land." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," she said before he could try another explanation. "Come in and eat bread when it comes out. You can look at the barn door while it rises." He fixed the barn door that morning, and 2 other things she had not yet mentioned to anyone: a loose stone in the chimney base and a broken spoke in her wagon wheel that she had been meaning to replace and had not gotten to. He worked quietly and well, with the kind of deep competence that told her he had been fixing things for himself in isolated places for many years. They ate bread at her table with butter and honey, and she made coffee strong the way she liked it, and she asked him about the mountains. She asked because she was curious. Emma had never been a woman to ask questions simply for the sake of conversation, Every question she asked was genuine, and the answers always interested her. She asked him what it was like to winter in the Absarokas, what he trapped, whether he was afraid of the cold. "The cold is honest," he said. "It doesn't pretend to be anything but what it is." "Some people would say that about loneliness too," she said. He looked at her. "You'd be right," he said, "but you can get used to cold. And not to loneliness." He was quiet for a moment. "I've gotten used to it," he said carefully, as though he was revising something as he spoke. "I haven't decided it's a good thing to be used to." Emma turned her coffee mug in her hands. "I have been alone here for 2 years," she said, not as a complaint but as a fact, because facts were things she respected. "I have gotten very good at it. I have almost convinced myself I prefer it." "Almost," he said. She looked up at him. "Almost," she agreed. They sat with that word between them for a moment, and outside the birds were loud in the bright May morning, and the light came through her window at the angle that turned the wood of the table golden, and Emma thought, in a clear and startling moment of self-honesty, that this was the most at ease she had been in a very long time. He came back the following Tuesday. She did not pretend to be surprised. She had told herself all week that she was not expecting him, and then she had made extra cornbread on Tuesday morning just in case, and she had put on the blue dress instead of the gray one, and she had braided her hair more carefully than usual, and by the time she heard his horse she had given up being dishonest with herself. He brought her a side of venison that time, which was practical and also generous, and a book. She looked at it in something close to astonishment. "Where did you get this?" she asked, turning it over. It was a volume of poetry, Mary Wollstonecraft's letters actually, slim and worn. "Callaway Creek has a lending shelf at the hotel," he said. "Mention to Dolores that you might enjoy it." He paused. "She said to send her regards. Dolores Henderson. She said she knew your mother." Emma held the book and felt the complicated sweetness of being thought of. "You spoke to Dolores Henderson about me." "I asked her what you might like to read," he said, as though that were an entirely ordinary thing, and perhaps to him it was. She read him 3 poems from the book over dinner that evening, and he listened with the same deep attention he gave to everything. And when she finished the 3rd one he said, "Read it again," and she did, and the 2nd time his eyes were closed. After that it became a kind of pattern, though neither of them named it a pattern or said anything to suggest that it was anything other than neighborly. He came on Tuesdays. He always brought something, game or hardware or something he had made in his camp, a set of wooden toggles for her barn coat, a small shelf bracket cut from mountain ash. She always cooked. She always read to him after if the evening stretched long enough. Sometimes they sat on the porch and watched the dark come in over the hills, the last of the light going pink and lavender above the Absarokas, and he would say something brief and true about the mountains, and she would answer, and the silence between their words had the quality of something comfortable, something lived in. In Callaway Creek, people began to notice. Emma's brother Thomas noticed first, because Thomas was perceptive in the way of young people who have watched the world carefully from a position of relative powerlessness. He came out to the cabin on a Saturday in late May and found Gilbert Blackwell rehanging the gate to the kitchen garden with new iron hardware, and Thomas stood watching him for a long moment before coming to find Emma in the kitchen. "Who is the mountain man in your garden?" he asked. "Gilbert Blackwell," Emma said, without looking up from the pot she was stirring. Thomas waited. When Emma said nothing more, he said, "And he traps in the Absarokas," she said. "He carried me across Bitter Creek when it was flooded in April." Thomas absorbed this. "He carried you. It was practical." "Uh-huh," Thomas said, in the tone of someone very carefully not laughing. "Close your mouth, Thomas." "I didn't say anything. You were thinking loudly." Thomas looked out the window at Gilbert, who was working with focused, unhurried competence. "He seems like a very practical man," Thomas said, and Emma could hear the smile he was suppressing. "He is," she said. "He's fixing your gate. I know that." "Why?" "Because I am your sister and I run this property alone and there is too much to do," Emma said. and the edge in her voice was honest exasperation rather than anger. And Thomas heard the difference and dropped the teasing, because he loved his sister more than he liked a joke. He stayed for dinner that evening, and he talked to Gilbert with the careful, measuring quality of a younger person assessing someone who matters to their family. Gilbert talked to him about the fur trade, about the Upsarokas, about the way the territory was changing as more settlers came north from Wyoming. He spoke to Thomas as an equal, not talking down, not performing patience. He was genuinely interested in what Thomas had to say about his studies, asked questions about the books Thomas was reading, recommended 2 titles by authors Emma had not heard of. When Thomas left that evening, he paused beside Emma on the porch and said, quietly, "He is a good man, Emma." "I know," she said just as quietly. "He looks at you like you are something worth looking at." Emma said nothing. "I just thought you should know," Thomas said, and kissed her cheek and mounted his horse and rode back toward town. Emma stood on the porch in the blue evening and thought about what her brother had said, and then she went inside and looked at the small table beside her bed, and she opened the drawer, and the piece of paper with 3 words on it was still there. "Thank you kindly." She was falling in love with Gilbert Blackwell. She knew it the way she knew most things, clearly and without drama, by simply being honest with herself about the facts. The facts were that she counted the days until Tuesday. The facts were that she slept better on Tuesday nights than any other night of the week. The facts were that when he said her name, Emma, in his low, deliberate way, something in her chest responded like a string on an instrument being plucked. What she did not know was what he felt. He was careful. He was generous. He was consistent in the way that she had come to understand was his nature, the way the mountains were consistent, not simple but reliable in their complexity. He did not say things he did not mean. He did not do things without reason. She believed, carefully, that his reasons for coming to her cabin every Tuesday had grown beyond neighborly helpfulness. But he had not said anything, and she was not going to say it first, because she was still deciding, still turning the question over in her hands the way she turned a stone to see all its faces before she set it in a wall. Then in early June, Amos Harding rode out to her property. He came on a Wednesday, which meant Gilbert was not there, which Emma suspected was not an accident because she was beginning to understand that Amos Harding did not do things accidentally. He rode up in a good black buggy with a matched pair of bays, and he climbed down with the particular dignity of a man who carries his prosperity in his posture, and he took off his hat to her on the porch. "Miss Rourke," he said, "I hope I am not disturbing you." "You are," Emma said pleasantly, "but please come in." He sat at her table in the same chair where Gilbert sat on Tuesdays, and she did not offer him coffee because she was petty in certain specific ways and felt no guilt about it. "I'll come to the point," Harding said, smoothing his coat. "The debt on this property, $215 by September 1st. I know you are working hard, Miss Rourke. Everyone in Callaway Creek knows you are a capable woman, but the numbers are the numbers." "They are," Emma said. "I am meeting them." "You have $43 in payment so far," he said, which told her he had been keeping very close track indeed. "I have more than that now," she said. "I have 81. Something flickered in his expression. He had not expected her to be that far along. "That is admirable," he said. "You still need $134 in the next 3 months." "I am aware of the mathematics," Emma said. He looked around the cabin. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he is already pricing. "I want to offer you an alternative," he said. Emma's hands, folded on the table, went still. "I have a proposal," Harding said, and the word landed with a weight that told her it was not the commercial kind. "I am a widower of 2 years. I have a large house. I have social position in this community. You are a young woman of good character carrying a considerable burden alone. It seems to me that a marriage would resolve several problems at once." The silence in the cabin was absolute. Emma looked at Amos Harding. She was 24 years old, and she had kept this land and her brother's schooling and her own dignity through 2 years of being alone, and she looked at this man sitting in Gilbert Blackwell's chair, making her an offer that was less a proposal than a financial negotiation, and she felt something cold and clear move through her. "Mr. Harding," she said, "I appreciate that you have expressed yourself honestly. I will be equally honest. I do not intend to marry anyone for the purpose of resolving a debt. I intend to pay this debt myself. I will have the full $215 to you by September 1st. Harding looked at her. "That is a very bold statement." "It is an accurate one," she said. "And if it is not accurate, if September 1st comes and the money is not there, then I will face that then," she said. "But I will not make decisions based on fear." He stood, replacing his hat. He was not angry, which was somehow worse than if he had been. He was patient, the way a patient creditor is patient. "The offer stands," he said, "should you change your mind." "I will not," she said. She watched his buggy go down her lane, and then she sat back down at the table and put her face in her hands, not weeping, but breathing carefully, methodically, through the fear she had refused to show him. $134 in 3 months. She stayed up that night making plans on paper. She could double her herb production if she converted the south quarter of the kitchen garden. She could take on washing and mending work. The single men in Callaway Creek always needed it, and she had done it before without shame. She could sell Clarence, but that would cost her the ability to haul, which would cost her more. She could ask Thomas to postpone his education and come home, but she would rather pay Harding in her own blood than do that. When Gilbert arrived on Tuesday, she was so deep in her accounts that she did not hear his horse until he knocked on the open door. He knew something was wrong immediately. She saw him see it, his eyes going to her face and then to the papers on the table and then back to her face. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee." "Emma," he said, and just the one word, her name in his voice, undid something in her that she had been holding tightly all week. "Harding came," she said. She told him everything, because she was not a woman who concealed her battles from people she trusted, and she had, somewhere in the last weeks, begun to trust Gilbert Blackwell with a completeness that still startled her when she examined it. She told him about the debt, about the offer, about her refusal, about the numbers. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "You refused him," he said. "Of course I refused him." He looked at the table. "You are going to make it," he said. "I have to make it," she said. "I know, but I mean you will." He said it with the same certainty he used for weather and river crossings, as though he had looked at the evidence and arrived at a conclusion. "What do you need?" "I do not need anything from you," she said quickly, because she wanted that established clearly. "I know that," he said. "I am asking what you need." The distinction, so precisely made, stopped her. She looked at him. He was looking back at her steadily, his big hands around his coffee mug, his expression carrying no condescension, no pity, just attention. "I need more money than I can make in 3 months on my own," she said honestly. "I sell my winter pelts in Helena in late July," he said. "I do well enough." "Gilbert, I am not offering charity," he said, and his voice was firm but careful. "I am offering a loan, Emma, a proper one. At no interest, because that is the difference between a neighbor and a creditor. You can put it in writing if that makes it easier." She stared at him. "Why would you do that?" He looked at her across the table, and something in his expression changed, shifted, like a landscape when clouds move off it and the sun comes full. It was not dramatic. It was simply that he stopped being careful for a moment and let her see something he had been, in his own way, deciding about. "I think you know why," he said quietly. Emma's heart was doing the thing it did when he said her name in that particular way. "Perhaps I do," she said, "but I think you should say it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been coming back every Tuesday because this is the only place in the territory where I do not wish I were somewhere else." She sat very still. "I have been coming back," he said, "because you read poetry like you believe every word of it, and you fix things before they break, and you argued with me from the middle of a flooded river about your own competence, and you are the most—" He stopped. He was not a man who ran out of words often, but he seemed to be choosing very carefully. "You are the most fully present person I have ever been in a room with," he said. "You make everywhere you are feel like the right place to be." Outside, the Montana summer was loud with birds and wind, and the distant sound of the creek running high from the snowmelt. Inside, Emma Rourke sat at her kitchen table and felt, for the first time in 2 years, like someone was sharing the weight of her life rather than observing it from a distance. "I am not an easy woman," she said. "I want you to know that before anything." "I know that," he said, and the corner of his mouth did the thing that was not quite a smile. "You told me from the middle of a river." "I was serious." "So am I." She reached across the table and put her hand over one of his. His hand was very large and very warm and very still beneath hers. "I think," she said carefully, "that I would like to know you better, Gilbert Blackwell, if that is something you would like." "It is," he said. "It is exactly something I would like." They sat like that for a while, her hand over his, the summer coming through the windows, and it was the quietest, most certain beginning Emma had ever experienced, and she thought it suited them both exactly. She did not take his money. She told him so the following Tuesday, clearly and without apology, and he accepted it with the same respect he gave every decision she made. What she did accept was his labor. He came twice a week through June and July, and he helped her clear and plant the south quarter of the garden, and he brought her game so her food costs were almost nothing, and he fixed every broken thing on the property so that she did not have to pay someone in town. He helped her haul her summer harvest to Callaway Creek, and the savings she made on that alone were significant. And she worked. She worked harder than she had ever worked in her life. She took in washing for 6 of the single men at the livery and the mill. She expanded her preserves and sold them through the hotel, where Dolores Henderson turned out to be a surprisingly effective advocate, telling everyone who came through that the Rourke preserves were the finest in the territory, which was generous and probably true. She asked Thomas to help her on weekends, and he did cheerfully, and he and Gilbert developed an easy friendship based largely on Thomas asking Gilbert questions about the mountains that Gilbert answered with patient detail and Thomas's absolute fascination. In the evenings when Gilbert stayed late, they talked. They talked about everything. About her father and the way he had named his horse after a senator he admired. About Gilbert's childhood in Kentucky, his father a blacksmith, his mother a schoolteacher, and how he had come west at 19 after his father died, and had kept going until he found the mountains and understood that they were where he was meant to be. About the injustice of the homesteading laws that made a woman's land claim precarious and dependent on male approval, in ways that no one in Washington seemed troubled by. About the way the territory was changing, the cattle ranchers coming up from Texas and Wyoming, the railroad companies buying land in great chunks, the Crow and the Blackfoot being pushed into smaller and smaller spaces by treaties that were already being broken. Gilbert spoke about this with a kind of quiet anger because he had traded with Crow men for years and known them as neighbors and colleagues, and he had watched the promises made to them dissolve like April snow. Emma listened with the same anger because she understood from her own smaller experience of being a woman alone trying to hold property, something of what it was to have the law arranged against you. "It is not right," she said one evening. "No," he said, "it is not." "People will keep coming, though," she said. "There is nothing that will stop it." "No," he said. "But there is something to be said for the people who treat their neighbors fairly, even when the law does not require it." He paused. "Your father was that kind of man. The Crow traders who came through here, Caleb Rourke dealt with them straight. He believed that everyone deserved a fair shake," Emma said. "He said it was the only law worth following." "He was right," Gilbert said. By mid-July, Emma had $162 in the strongbox. She counted it 3 times because she could not quite believe the number. She was $43 short with 6 weeks to go, and for the first time since Harding had ridden up her lane, she felt something close to certainty that she was going to make it. She was also, by this point, entirely and completely in love with Gilbert Blackwell, and she was fairly sure that he was in love with her, and they had kissed exactly once, On a June evening on the porch when the light was going orange and she had turned to say something to him and found him very close. And for a moment neither of them had moved, and then he had very gently pressed his lips to hers, brief and warm and absolutely certain, and then pulled back and looked at her with those river-colored eyes. And she had said with remarkable composure, "You could have asked." And he had said, "You seemed decided," and she had laughed, a real laugh surprised out of her, and the evening had stretched on with both of them a little brighter and a little less careful. In late July, Gilbert rode to Helena to sell his winter pelts. He was gone for 8 days, and Emma was surprised by how much quieter the world was without the expectation of his company. She filled the time efficiently, because she was always efficient, but the evenings were different. She found herself looking up from her book at the sound of horses on the road, and then going back to her book when it was not him. She wrote him a letter while he was gone. She had not planned to. She was sitting at the table one evening and she picked up her pen and paper and began, and by the time she was done she had written 4 pages. She wrote about the garden and what had come in, about a conversation she had with Thomas about whether to read Dickens or Hawthorne, about a thunderstorm that had rolled over the Upsarokas and lit the sky for an hour. She wrote at the end that she was glad he existed. She said it plainly, without decoration, because she was not a woman for unnecessary decoration. She did not know where to send it. She folded it and kept it in the drawer with the piece of paper that said "Thank you kindly." He came back on a Thursday in late July, 2 days before she expected him. She was at the well drawing water when she heard his horse, and she looked up and he was riding into her yard with the bay gelding dust-covered from the Helena road, and his face tired from 8 days of riding. He got down from the horse and she stood there by the well with the bucket in her hands, and he walked straight to her and said, "Hello, Emma," and she said, "Hello, Gilbert." And then he put his hands on either side of her face very carefully, the way you handle something valuable, and he kissed her properly this time, the kind of kiss that was not a question but an answer, long and warm and full of the 8 days he had been away. When he pulled back, she said, "I wrote you a letter." "Did you?" "While you were gone, I did not know where to send it, so I kept it. Can I read it?" "I will think about it," she said, and the corner of her mouth did its own small version of the thing his did. He sold the pelts for a very good price. She did not ask how much, because it was not her business. But that week he paid off an account he had been running at the general store, and she saw that it was settled in full, and she understood that he had been managing carefully for a while, and that the good season had given him room to breathe. He did not offer her money again. He seemed to understand that she had meant it. But what he did do, on the first Tuesday of August, was ride to Callaway Creek with her when she went in to make her payment to Harding, and he stood outside the store in the bright August morning with his horse and his absolute stillness while she went in. She came out 8 minutes later with her receipt for $20 and the composure of a woman who has just endured a conversation with a man who is convinced she is going to fail. "He offered again," she said, when she reached Gilbert. "I guessed he might," Gilbert said. "He seemed surprised that I had this much. And I told him he would see the rest of it by September 1st. She mounted Clarence with the ease of long practice. He had the expression of a man who does not believe something but has learned not to say so. "And you?" Gilbert asked. "I believe it," she said. "That is what matters." He rode beside her out of town. It was a bright August morning, the hills gold and green, the sky so blue it seemed almost implausible. Emma felt, riding beside him in the morning light, that this was a good life, that it was going to be a good life, and that she had earned the right to feel that. She paid the final amount on August 28th, 4 days before the deadline. She rode into Callaway Creek alone on purpose, because this was her victory and she wanted to feel the full weight of it herself. She had $215 in the strongbox, which she had wrapped carefully in cloth and put in her saddlebag, and she walked into Amos Harding's store at 10 o'clock in the morning and put the money on his counter. He counted it twice. He was very quiet. "You'll write the deed in my name," Emma said, "clear of any encumbrance." "Miss Rourke, the property is my father's gift to me," she said. It has my name on the claim. I want a clear deed in my name, Mr. Harding, and I want it today." He wrote the deed. He was not happy and he was not gracious, but he was businesslike, which was all she required. She walked out of his store with a clear deed to 40 acres of Montana territory in her hands, and she stood on the wooden sidewalk in the August sun and breathed. Thomas found her there. He had been watching from across the street with his hat in his hands, having apparently guessed or been told she was coming, and he came across the street and hugged her, and she let herself be hugged for a full minute, which was longer than she usually allowed. "Pa would be proud," Thomas said into her hair. "I know," she said. "I know he would." She told Gilbert that evening. He was on her porch when she got home, sitting on the railing in the late afternoon light with his hat beside him, and she rode up the lane and got down from Clarence and held up the deed. He came off the railing and took it from her, looked at it, handed it back. His expression was something she was still learning to read, the way he allowed feeling to show in small ways, a quality of attention, a warmth in the set of his jaw. "Done," he said. "Done," she agreed. He stepped down from the porch and came to her, and he put his arms around her, and she put her face against his shoulder, and they stood in the yard in the late August evening with the Montana hills going golden around them. "I found the letter," he said into her hair. She pulled back. "What? You put it in the drawer beside your bed," he said, and there was a carefulness in his voice. "I was looking for a candle while you were in Callaway Creek last week. I saw it. I did not read it, but I knew it was there." "You did not read it." "It was not mine to read until you gave it to me," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she went inside and came back with the letter unfolded and put it in his hands. He read it there on the porch in the last light, and she watched him read it, and when he got to the end and the part where she had written that she was glad he existed, he looked up at her with those river-colored eyes, and she saw something in them that she thought she might spend the rest of her life being glad to see. "Emma," he said. "Yes," she said. "I intend to ask you something," he said. "I want to ask it properly. I want you to tell me if the time is not right." "It is right," she said before he had finished the sentence. He looked at her. "You were going to ask," she said, "and I was going to say yes, and I do not see any reason to make you ask it first and wait for the answer when I can just tell you the answer is yes." His mouth did the thing, the almost smile wider now than it had ever been. "You were deciding," he said. "I decided," she said. "You told me I was standing there deciding. I decided." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh fully, with his whole self in it. And it was the most beautiful thing she had heard in the Montana territory, better than the creek and the wind in the pines. And she laughed too, and he pulled her in and held her close, and the evening came down warm around them both. They were married in October. Dolores Henderson organized the affair with the enthusiasm of a woman who had been hoping for it for months, and the wedding was small but full of warmth, held in the small church at Callaway Creek with Thomas as witness, and a dozen neighbors crowded in the pews. Emma wore her mother's brooch on her Sunday dress, blue wool with a white collar, and she had put her hair up with 2 pearl-headed pins that had been her mother's as well. She was not a woman for ceremony, but she felt the weight of the occasion and carried it gladly. Gilbert wore a dark coat she had never seen before, well cut and clearly his best, and he stood at the front of the church with the absolute stillness that was his nature, and watched her walk toward him with an expression that made Dolores Henderson cry and Thomas look at the ceiling, so he would not follow suit. The minister asked the words and they said the words, and when it came to the part about the ring, Gilbert took from his coat pocket a ring of simple silver that he had made in Helena in July. He had ordered it, she later understood, during the trip when he sold his pelts, while he was still in the early weeks of whatever they had been becoming to each other. He had been, in his own particular way, decided. She kissed him in the little church at Callaway Creek, with Montana autumn light coming through the windows, and she felt, with complete and quiet certainty, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. They went home to her cabin after the celebration at the hotel, which involved pie and dancing and more warmth than Emma had felt in a public space in years. The drive home in the wagon was slow and quiet, the stars enormous overhead, the hills dark and still. Gilbert drove and Emma sat beside him with her hand in his, and they did not say very much because there was nothing that needed to be said. The cabin was different with two people in it. It was fuller in every sense. Gilbert moved into the space carefully, the way he did everything, taking no more of it than he needed, and yet filling it completely. He built a second set of shelves for his own few belongings. He added a hook beside the door for his coat. He moved the woodpile to a better position nearer the back door and built a proper woodshed so it would not get wet, and the winter came in November, early and sharp, and they were warm. He told her about the mountains in the evenings. He described them in winter, the way the snow came down the passes, the silence that was different from any other silence in the world, the way the stars looked from 8,000 feet with no lanterns for 40 miles in any direction. He had been going to the Absarokas every winter for 9 years, and she listened to every detail as though she were learning the biography of someone she loved, which she was. "Will you go this winter?" She asked him one evening in November with the stove burning and the wind going white around the cabin. He looked at her. "Do you want me to?" "I am asking what you want," she said. "I want to be here," he said simply. "The mountains will wait." She turned the idea over. "You should go," she said. "In spring I want to come with you." He looked at her with that particular quality of attention. "Come with me. To the Absarokas. You said you winter there. I want to see them. It is hard country. I broke 40 acres of Montana territory and paid off a debt that would have broken a lesser person," she said pleasantly. "I think I can manage the Absarokas." He sat back and looked at her with the closest thing to open delight she had ever seen on his face. "All right," he said. "Spring." That winter was the best winter Emma could remember. Not because it was easy, because Montana winters were never easy, but because the difficulty was shared, and shared difficulty, she discovered, was a completely different thing from difficulty borne alone. They got up together in the cold mornings and built the fire together and ate together and worked the days together. And in the evenings they read by the stove, sometimes aloud and sometimes in companionable silence, and every night she fell asleep warm. Thomas came for Christmas, and they fed him until he looked alarmed, and he and Gilbert spent 2 days doing something in the barn that turned out to be a proper workbench, which Emma had wanted and never had, and she found them both absurdly pleased with themselves when it was done. In February, Emma told Gilbert that she thought she was expecting a child. She told him in the morning, sitting at the table over coffee, plainly, the way she said everything important. She watched his face and saw something move through it that she could not quite name, a kind of quiet that was different from his usual quiet, something that had depth in it like a clear mountain lake. He put his coffee mug down and he looked at her for a long moment. "Are you well?" he asked first. "I am very well," she said. "Good," he said, and then carefully he smiled. Not the almost smile, a full, genuine, unguarded smile that she had only seen in glimpses before, and that now arrived complete and stayed, and it was everything. She told Thomas on his next visit, and Thomas became incapable of useful conversation for approximately 20 minutes while he processed the information. Then he hugged her for a long time and shook Gilbert's hand with both of his, and Gilbert endured the enthusiasm with good grace. Spring came in March, tentative and then definite, the snow going off the lower hills first and the snowmelt running the creeks high again. Emma watched the bitter creek crossing from the road when she drove past it, and it was flooded again, higher than last April, the brown water churning exactly as she remembered. She was past the worst of the early pregnancy sickness by then, and she was working the garden again, planning the planting with the efficiency she brought to everything. Gilbert was preparing for the spring trapping run, shorter than his usual season, because he was not going to the high Absarokas this year. He had decided that without drama. He would trap the lower country, within a day's ride of home, and return to the higher mountains in the fall or perhaps the following spring, when Emma would be more safely through the birth. She argued with him about it once, just once, because she wanted it on record that she did not need him to diminish himself on her account. "I am not diminishing myself," he said, with the particular patience that she had come to understand was not condescension but genuine steadiness. "I am making a choice about what matters more. The high country will be there next year. This year I want to be close." She looked at him. "You are absolutely certain about that?" "I am absolutely certain about that," he said. She did not argue further because when he said something in that particular way, with that particular quality of certainty, she had learned that he had thought it through completely and there was nothing left to reconsider. He was not a man who spoke without meaning, and he was not a man who meant without being sure. In April, she went back to Bitter Creek. She had not planned it. She was driving back from Callaway Creek with Thomas beside her, the first time she had been to town since the winter, and when they reached the crossing she pulled Clarence to a stop. The water was high but not impassable. A foot lower than last year, the bottom visible in the shallows, but she sat there for a moment looking at it. Thomas looked at her. "Emma, I am thinking," she said. About last April," she said. "I was standing here deciding and he just picked me up." Thomas was quiet. "I did not know anything about him," she said. "I did not know his name or where he lived or what kind of man he was. He just picked me up and carried me across and put me down on the other bank like it was the most reasonable thing in the world." "And then you fed him supper," Thomas said. "I was raised with manners," Emma said. "And now he is your husband," Thomas said, "and you are having his child." "Yes," Emma said. She was still looking at the creek. "Because I was standing there deciding and he decided for both of us." "He decided to cross the river," Thomas said. "You decided everything after that." Emma looked at her brother. He was 20 now and increasingly insightful in ways that occasionally surprised her. "You are getting wise," she said. "I have a very good teacher," he said, and he meant her, and they both knew it. And she reached over and ruffled his hair in the way she used to when he was small, and he protested and smoothed it back, and they crossed the creek without stopping and drove home through the April morning. The baby came in October. It was a long labor, and Emma endured it with the same ferocity she applied to everything, and Gilbert stayed close throughout, never useless, never in the way, calm in the way she needed him to be calm. Dolores Henderson was there, and the doctor from Callaway Creek, a steady woman named Clara Briggs who had come west from Philadelphia and set up practice in the territory because there was need of it, and Emma was glad she was there, and glad for Dolores, and most of all glad for Gilbert's hand when she needed it. The baby was a boy. He came into the world loud and strong, and Gilbert held him first because Emma put him there, and she watched this enormous, quiet, steady man hold their son with a care so precise and complete that she felt the entire weight of love for him almost too large to contain. "Caleb," she said. Gilbert looked at her. His eyes were bright. "After my father," she said. "Caleb," he said, and it sounded right in his low voice. He looked down at the baby. "Hello, Caleb." They brought Gilbert Blackwell home to the cabin on a cool October morning, and the mountains were going bronze and red with autumn, and the air had the particular clarity of October in the Montana Territory, and Emma carried her son through the door of the cabin her father had built on the land she had fought for, and Gilbert Blackwell closed the door behind them both. Thomas rode out that afternoon, and held the baby with the expression of a man who has just understood that his life has acquired something entirely new and precious in it. He sat with Caleb for a long time, talking to him in a low voice about absolutely everything, and the baby seemed interested in Thomas's voice, which made Thomas look absurdly pleased. The years that followed were full. They were full in the way that good lives are full, not without hardship, because the Montana Territory did not offer its settlers an easy life, but abundant in the things that matter. Gilbert built the cabin larger in Caleb's second year, adding a room on the north side with 2 windows and a proper floor, and then a summer kitchen in the third year, and the property expanded gradually as Gilbert turned his eye to what the land could do beyond what it had been doing. He planted an orchard on the east slope, apple trees, and a line of cherry trees that would not bear fruit for years but would be magnificent when they did. He dug a proper root cellar. He built a smokehouse. He did not stop going to the mountains. In Caleb's second autumn, when the boy was healthy and walking and had Thomas and Emma around him, Gilbert went to the Upsarokas for 6 weeks, and he came back with his best season's catch in years, and a light in his face that told Emma the mountains had fed something in him that nothing else could, and she was glad she had insisted he go. He always came back. He came back the way the seasons came back, expected and reliable and wonderful for being both. Emma's herb and preserve business had grown into something she had not quite anticipated. By Caleb's 3rd year, she was supplying 3 hotels along the eastern corridor of the territory and had taken on a woman named Ruth Pearson, the rancher's daughter, to help with the production in high summer. She kept careful accounts and paid wages fairly, and she was known in Callaway Creek as a woman whose business was as good as her word, which was as good as anything in the territory. She wrote to a women's suffrage organization in the East about the property law issues she had encountered, a letter that took her 3 evenings to write, and that she polished until every word was right. She received a reply 6 weeks later thanking her for her detailed account and inviting her to contribute to their newsletter. She did, and it was the first of many such contributions, and Thomas, when he read them, told her she should consider a career in journalism, and she told him to focus on his teaching examination. Thomas passed his examination in the summer of Caleb's 2nd year and became the school teacher at Callaway Creek's new school, which had been funded partly through a community subscription and partly through the territorial government. He was 22 and the youngest teacher in that part of Montana, and he was good at it in the way some people are born to a vocation. He wrote lessons that made children want to come back the next day. He treated every student, including the Crow children whose families had land near the settlement, with the same respect and seriousness. He was Emma's brother through and through. He married a young woman named Clara Hartley the following spring, a sweet-natured and very funny woman who worked as the hotel cook's assistant, and who had a laugh that could be heard 3 buildings away. The wedding was held at the Callaway Creek Church on an April morning, and Emma stood beside her brother and held Caleb on her hip, and Gilbert sat in the front pew looking at Emma with those river-colored eyes, and she caught his look and held it for a moment across the small, warm church, and everything in that look was home. In the spring of Caleb's 4th year, Emma told Gilbert she was expecting again. He received this information the same way he had received the first, with a quiet that was full of feeling and a smile that arrived complete. This time it was a girl. She came in November more quickly than her brother and with an apparent opinion about the proceedings that she expressed vigorously. Emma held her and looked at her red face and her dark hair, dark like Gilbert's, and felt the old fierce swell of love. "Iris," Emma said. "I want to name her Iris." "After your mother," Gilbert said. "After the flower," Emma said. "My mother grew irises along the south fence every summer. She loved them more than anything in the garden." "Iris Blackwell," Gilbert said, taking the baby while Emma rested. He held her with the same careful completeness he had held Caleb. "Hello, Iris." The baby looked at him with the dark, solemn regard of the very newly arrived. "She is deciding," Emma said from the pillow. "They do that," Gilbert said, with the corner of his mouth. Caleb, who was 4, came to look at his sister with the expression of someone who has been promised something and is not yet sure about the delivery. He stood on his tiptoes beside his father's chair and looked at the baby for a long time. "She is small," he said. "You were small," Gilbert said. "I'm not small now," Caleb said, which was true. He was large for his age, built like his father. "No," Gilbert said. "You are not." Caleb seemed to accept his sister then, as a matter settled. He came every morning after that to check on her, standing in the doorway of the new room where she slept, watching her breathe with a seriousness that made Emma's heart turn over in her chest. By the time Iris was a year old and pulling herself to standing on everything in the cabin, and Caleb was 5 and following Gilbert around the property, learning every task with the deep attentiveness of a child who wants to understand everything. Emma looked at her life and took its measure. She had the land, clear and hers. She had the business, growing steadily. She had Thomas 2 miles away with his wife and his students and his noise and his laughter. She had the cabin larger and warmer than her parents had left it, the orchard going in the east slope, the smokehouse full in November, the root cellar organized with the precision she brought to all organized things. She had Caleb, who was going to be exactly like his father in all the ways that mattered, quiet and attentive and capable beyond his years. She had Iris, who was going to be exactly like herself in all the ways that mattered, opinionated and early talking, and absolutely impossible to redirect once she had decided on something. She had Gilbert. One evening in late November, when the children were asleep, and the fire was low, and the wind was doing its long, cold business outside, she sat on the porch in her coat because she sometimes needed the cold air to think clearly, and he came and sat beside her without being asked. They sat for a while in the quiet. "Do you remember," she said, "what you said to me when I asked why you carried me across the river?" "I said you were standing there deciding," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have thought about that a great deal over the years." He waited. "I think," she said, "that I have been deciding my whole life. Every step I have taken on this land has been a decision. Every jar of preserves, every fence post, every payment to Harding, every letter I wrote to the suffrage organization. Every morning I got up alone when I was alone." She paused. "You were the first person who ever respected my deciding and moved the obstacle anyway." He looked at her in the dark. "You did not tell me not to cross the river," she said. "You did not tell me I could not. You just decided that you were not going to make me cross it alone." He was quiet for a moment. "That is what it was," he said. "I know," she said. "I just wanted to say it where you could hear it. I wanted you to know that I understood." He took her hand. His hand was as warm as it had been on every day of the years she had known him, that particular warmth that she thought of when she thought of him as simply his. "I understood you from the beginning," he said. "That was the thing. Most people stand at a flooded river and need someone to tell them they can cross. You were doing the mathematics. You were calculating the risk. I just saved you the water." She leaned her head against his shoulder. The mountains, invisible in the dark, were out there in the November night, enormous and steady and patient, exactly as they always were. "Thank you," she said into his coat. "Thank you kindly," he said quietly, and she felt him smile, and she laughed low and warm, and the laughter rose into the cold Montana night and disappeared into the stars. They went inside together. They went inside to the warmth and the sleeping children and the shelves of books and the preserved food and the clear deed framed above the mantelpiece. They went inside to the life they had built, decision by decision, river crossing by river crossing, Tuesday by Tuesday, in the Montana Territory in the years when everything was still being made. In the spring, Gilbert took Emma to the Upsarokas. They left the children with Thomas and Clara for 8 days and rode south and then east into the mountains on a May morning when the lower slopes were green and the high country still held its snow. He showed her the place where he wintered, the small cabin he had built in a mountain valley with a clear stream running below it and the peaks going white above, and she stood in the thin mountain air and looked at the view that had sustained him for 9 years before she was part of his life. "Oh," she said very quietly. "Yes," he said. She understood then completely the pull of this place. The scale of it, the silence of it, the way it made everything human feel appropriately small without making you feel diminished. She understood why he came back every year and would keep coming back, and she was glad for it, because it had made him the man who knew how to love her the way he did, with patience and with permanence and without unnecessary noise. They camped in his valley for 3 days and rode the high trails during the days and sat by the stream in the evenings, and Emma thought she had never been so happy in a place that was not her own land. On the last evening she opened her notebook, which she always carried, and wrote about the mountains in the particular way she wrote when something was important, with precision and with feeling, taking nothing for granted. He watched her write. "What are you writing?" he asked. "Everything," she said, "so I do not forget." "You won't forget," he said. "I know," she said, "but writing it makes me own it twice." He looked at her with the full and open affection that he had been less careful with since the early years, the look that had taken years to stop surprising her, and that she now received the way she received morning light, expected and still beautiful. "You should write more," he said. "I write to the suffrage newsletter," she said. "I mean beyond that," he said. "About the territory, about what it is actually like to live here, to build something here." She considered this, turning her pen in her hand. "That is a large undertaking." "You have been doing large undertakings since before I met you," he said. She looked at the mountains going gold in the evening light. She thought about her father's deed, and the 2 years of being alone, and the flooded river, and the $43 in the strongbox that had become $215. She thought about Caleb's first word, which had been, improbably and perfectly, window, and Iris's expression when she first saw snow, a look of absolute betrayal at the cold, and then, when it was in her hands, delight. She thought about Thomas at the front of his classroom, and Clara's 3 buildings wide laugh, and Gilbert's hand over her face before he kissed her the first time. "Maybe I will," she said. She did, eventually. It took another year to begin and 3 more to finish, but she wrote a long account of homesteading in the Montana Territory, a woman's account, detailed and specific and completely without self-pity, that Thomas helped her circulate to 2 publishers in the East, and the second one accepted it. It was published in 1881 and read by more people than she expected, and it said things about property law and women's rights, and the treatment of the Crow and the Blackfoot that needed to be said and had not been said in quite that way before. She sent a copy to Amos Harding. She inscribed it, "With regards, Emma Rourke Blackwell," and she did not add anything further because she was not petty in written form. She sent a copy to the suffrage organization, and they wrote back a letter that she kept in the drawer beside her bed with the other papers, the note that said "Thank you kindly," and the 4-page letter she had written to a man she did not yet know how to address, the letter that ended "I am glad you exist." Callaway Creek grew through the 1870s and into the 1880s. The railroad came through 40 miles south of them in 1881, which changed the supply routes and brought more settlers and raised the value of the land considerably. The cabin grew again, a 3rd room and then a proper kitchen extension, and the orchard bore fruit beginning in its 7th year. And the first time Emma bit into an apple from a tree Gilbert had planted when Caleb was 2 years old, she cried a little, standing in the east orchard in a September afternoon, which surprised her because she was not much given to crying over apple trees. Gilbert found her there and did not ask why she was crying because he understood it without asking. He stood beside her in the orchard and ate his own apple and looked at the mountains, and she collected herself and ate hers, and the orchard was loud with bees in the late afternoon heat. By 1882, Caleb was 9 and large and serious and learning trapping from his father with the absolute dedication of a child who has found his calling. He could identify animal tracks with a precision that startled Gilbert, who was not easily startled. He could read his mother's books and understand them, and had opinions about them that he expressed with a brevity that was entirely his father's. Iris was 7 and talking constantly, and had informed Emma that she intended to be a lawyer when she grew up, a statement that Emma received with complete seriousness, and Gilbert, with a look that combined pride and helplessness in equal measure. "Women cannot be lawyers," Thomas told her when she said it at Christmas dinner, meaning it as a gentle correction. "Not yet," Iris said, and the way she said it was so completely her mother's that Emma had to look at her plate to hide her smile. "Not yet," Emma agreed, looking up. "But things change. They are changing now." Iris looked satisfied. She had her father's eyes, that river-colored gray-green, and her mother's jaw, and she was going to be, Emma thought, an extraordinary person. On a May morning in 1882, 9 years after Emma Rourke had stood at the edge of Bitter Creek in the rain deciding whether to cross it, She drove the wagon to Callaway Creek with Iris beside her, and Caleb riding, alongside on a small chestnut pony that Gilbert had found and trained for him. Thomas met them in town, and they had lunch together at the hotel restaurant, and Emma ate a piece of apple pie with cinnamon and brown sugar, while Iris talked about her lessons and Caleb sat quietly eating and watching the street outside with attentive gray-green eyes. On the drive home, they passed the Bitter Creek crossing. The water was low this May, a dry spring, and the creek ran gentle and clear over its stones. Emma pulled Clarence to a stop and sat looking at it for a moment. "Why are we stopping?" Iris asked. "I was married to your father," Emma said, "because of this creek." Iris looked at the creek. It was a pleasant creek, small stones, clear water, not obviously romantic in any visible way. "How?" she asked. "It was flooded," Emma said. "I was standing here deciding whether to cross it, and your father came along and picked me up without asking and carried me across. And when I asked him why, he said I was standing there deciding." Iris considered this. "He should have asked," she said. "He should," Emma said. "But it worked out," Iris said. "It worked out," Emma agreed. Caleb had been listening from his pony. He looked at the creek and then at his mother with his father's eyes. "Are you glad he did it?" he asked. Emma looked at the clear water running over the stones where 9 years ago a brown flood had run and a man she did not know had picked her up in the rain and carried her to the other side. "I am glad of everything," she said. "Every single piece of it." She clicked to Clarence and they crossed the creek, all three of them, easy and dry-shod in the May morning, and the road went east toward home. Gilbert was in the orchard when they got back, doing something to one of the trees that Caleb immediately went to investigate. Emma put Iris down to run in the yard, and she stood by the wagon watching her husband and her son under the apple trees in the spring light. He looked up and saw her watching. He raised one hand, a simple acknowledgement. She raised hers back. 40 acres of Montana territory, clear and hers, a deed on the wall and an orchard going silver-green in May. 2 children, one with his eyes and one with her jaw, both entirely themselves. A husband who had known from a riverbank in the rain that she was worth waiting for. She was 33 years old and she was standing in her own yard on her own land in the morning light, and she was not deciding anything. Everything had already been decided, a long time ago, in one direction and then another, until all the decisions had added up to this. This yard, this light, these people, this life. She walked to the orchard. She came to stand beside Gilbert under the apple tree, and he put his arm around her shoulders without looking away from what he was showing Caleb about the branch. And she stood under the new green leaves with his arm around her and her son's intent face close by. And the mountains were visible above the tree line, white-capped and patient, and exactly as they had always been. "Mama, look," Caleb said, pointing at something on the branch that Gilbert was explaining, a place where the wood had knit itself back together after some old damage, a smooth scar that the tree had grown around and over until it was simply part of what it was. "I see," Emma said. "Father says that is called healing," Caleb said. "He is right," Emma said. She looked up at her husband. He was looking at her, not at the tree, not at Caleb, at her, with the river-colored eyes and the full, genuine smile that she had been seeing every day for 9 years and that still, every single time, felt like the first time. "It is," he said. "That is exactly what it is called." And the spring morning opened around them, wide and clear and generous, over the orchard and the cabin and the 40 acres of Montana territory where everything that mattered had happened, where everything that mattered was still happening, and the mountains watched it all from their ancient patient distance, and the creek ran clear over its stones, and the light held and held and held.